Today's lesson is the month the whole world held its breath. Hi, everybody. I'm Roger.
And I'm Mike.
And welcome to our program. And in today's edition of All+ Interactive English, we're going to be talking about an event in history which is referring to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the month the whole world held its breath back in October 1962.
And, of course, this was quite a long time ago, but it still has a lot of effects on our world today. I mean, if Vladimir Putin suddenly announced that he was putting nuclear missiles back into Cuba, that would trigger another global crisis, obviously. And also, from my personal memory, I wasn't actually alive at the time, but it has also led to several good movies. I remember a couple of good movies based around the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 Days, I believe, was the name of a Kevin Costner film, which follows sort of the inside decision-making in the John F. Kennedy White House. Very exciting movie that kind of brings the period to life. And I think a lot of older people do remember nuclear missile drills, and there was this real tension for 13 days, as the title of the movie went, or maybe, closer to a week for most people, where they really did feel like World War III could suddenly break out with nuclear missiles being just a few hundred kilometers away from America. So it's an important thing to learn and remember from history, and that's why we're going to be talking about it in our article.
So let's get to it. Let's listen to the first part right now, and we'll be right back to talk about it.
The month the whole world held its breath. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. The crisis began when American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, less than 150 kilometers away from the U.S. mainland. The Soviets had placed them there in response to U.S. nuclear missiles in Turkey near the Soviet border.
大家好，第一部分介绍形容词 nuclear， 它的意思是核武器的或是核能的。例如 A former president once said, "A nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought." 一位前总统曾说过，核战没有赢家，且永远不该开打。或者 According to most scientists, nuclear power is completely safe. 根据大多数科学家的说法，核能非常安全。接下来看到名词 missile， 表示飞弹或是导弹。例如 A missile was launched at the rebel hideout. 一枚飞弹从叛军的巢穴中发射。或是 The army used missiles to destroy the enemy's camp. 那个军队用飞弹摧毁敌人的阵营。接着看到片语 in response to， 指因应……例如 The editorial was written in response to the president's speech. 那篇社论是针对总统演说所写的回应。也可以说 Many birds are beginning to migrate southward in response to the approach of winter. 因应冬季的到来，许多鸟类开始往南迁徙。
Okay, so again, the title of our lesson for today is The Month the Whole World Held Its Breath. So here, held its breath is the past tense of to hold one's breath. That just means you stop breathing because you're kind of nervous about something or you're kind of waiting for some kind of result or whatever. You might hold your breath if your favorite baseball team is about to win. It's down to the last out, but the opponents are up. They've got 3 men on base, and if they get a hit, you're going to lose. But yeah, you might be holding your breath, and then you'll breathe a sigh of relief when your team actually wins. And that's probably what happened here. Everybody breathed a sigh of relief when this crisis was avoided. But again, this is the month everybody in the world was kind of waiting in great anticipation to see what was going to happen. So again, in October of 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before or since. Okay, so I guess that's the closest we ever came to blowing each other up with those nuclear bombs. Something is nuclear when it has to do with nuclear fission, breaking apart atoms like uranium or plutonium or whatever. But nowadays, of course, we've got fusion bombs as well. We've got all sorts of different ways to blow each other to smithereens.
That's absolutely right. Nuclear bombs. We also still use probably a bit scientifically outdated atomic bombs. As Roger explained, bombs technology has evolved. But of course, we talk about the atomic bombs dropped on Japan that ended World War II, but nuclear war, yeah, we wouldn't really say atomic war. Usually it's sort of atomic bombs. That's a common term you'll read in the newspaper, and that, of course, would be a consequence of nuclear war. So war involving these very, very dangerous, devastating weapons that thankfully have only been used once in conflict in human history. But this was another time. It was a time that we probably came the closest since dropping the bombs at the end of World War II. It says the crisis began when American spy planes discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, less than 150 kilometers away from the U.S. mainland. So that was the spark of the crisis, or how it began. These spy planes flying around American neighborhoods like Cuba, which is obviously not far. They discovered these Soviet nuclear missiles. So Soviet, that of course was the government that Russia had, also called the USSR, which would be another way you might see it written or described. So when we see Soviet, we just think of communist Russia during the 20th century. And they had nuclear missiles, missiles being rockets. Generally, if something non-military is put on a rocket, we might call it a rocket. But if it is a military weapon with some kind of a warhead, some kind of bomb on the tip of it that is designed for war and destruction, then it's a missile. We can also shoot smaller missiles, of course, from airplanes hanging off the wings of airplanes. We have missiles. And then these larger ones will usually be ground-based or ground-launched, land-based. So they had these missiles, these very large, powerful nuclear weapons there in Cuba. And obviously this was a concern, especially because of its proximity, how close the island of Cuba, you can see that on a map, it's less than 150 kilometers away from the U.S. mainland. And so these nuclear missiles, if they were allowed to be based in Cuba, would cover kind of the eastern half of America, much, much closer to America than anyone would be reasonably comfortable having them. And the U.S. mainland, that's what we use to describe the continental U.S. That's another way of describing it. These would be the 48 states inside North America, excluding Alaska, which is way up on the tip of Canada and the far north, and of course Hawaii, the islands in the middle of the Pacific. Those regions would be out of reach from these missiles, but the U.S. mainland, much of it was within reach because that is the continental U.S., where 95% or so of Americans live.
And the Soviets had placed them there in response to U.S. nuclear missiles in Turkey near the Soviet border. Okay, so the Americans put nuclear missiles in Turkey, which of course is a country in the Middle East there. I guess they had great relationships with the Turks back in those days. And they said, hey, can we put our missiles in your backyard to kind of point them at the Russians if they get to be naughty boys or something like that? The Turks said, okay, yeah, okay, fine, go ahead and do it. And the Russians weren't too happy about that, so they put missiles in Cuba in response to what the Americans did in Turkey. So in response to something just means as an answer to you do this, I do that, etc. So in response to your request, I have granted you a loan. If you have a request to the bank for a loan or something, that would be your request. So in response to your request, we have decided to grant you the loan. And yes, indeed, it was kind of a tit-for-tat situation. You do this, we're going to do that. So again, they had to resolve this particular problem. Okay, that brings us to the end of the first part of our lesson. Here comes the second part.
Following the discovery, U.S. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to stop Soviet ships from bringing in any more weapons. The Soviets were furious and sent several ships to approach the blockade. Though they turned back at the last moment, tensions remained high. With no peaceful solution in sight, the U.S. began to prepare for a possible attack on Cuba.
第二部分看到形容词 naval， 它的意思是海军的。例如 Keelung is home to one of Taiwan's naval bases. 基隆是台湾其中一座海军基地的所在地。再看一个例子 The spy was convicted of selling naval secrets to the enemy. 那名间谍因为向敌方出售海军机密而被定罪。下一个介绍名词 blockade 表示封锁。我们可以说Many civilians were trapped inside the city due to the blockade. 许多平民因封锁而被困在城内。又或者说 The Navy set up a blockade to prevent supplies from reaching the enemy. 海军设立封锁线以阻止补给品到达敌军手中。继续看到形容词 furious， 意思是暴怒的或是怒不可遏的。例如 Eva was furious because her boyfriend told her to lose weight. Eva 因为男朋友叫她减肥而发怒。
All right, so now we have the setup of how the whole Cuban Missile Crisis began. Let's see how it all played out. It says, following the discovery of these new Soviet missiles not far from America there in Cuba, so following the discovery through these spy plane pictures, U.S. President John F. Kennedy ordered a naval blockade around Cuba to stop Soviet ships from bringing in any more weapons. So they had several options at this point. They could have attacked the weapons, attacked the missile sites there on Cuba, but there was great fear that that would start a real war. If one country attacks another one and bombs its territory, that could definitely be a cause for war. So instead of that, they ordered a naval blockade. Naval meaning things to do with fighting on the ocean, and the Navy. The Navy are the waterborne military forces of many countries. You have the Army on the land, the Air Force in the air, and the Navy on the seas. And so naval has to do with the Navy. So battleships, aircraft carriers, things like that. And a blockade is basically when you surround something and stop things from going in and out. So they would basically position a lot of U.S. military Navy assets, U.S. Navy ships around Cuba, and they would kind of stop things from going in. I mean, a lot of people say that that could happen with Taiwan and China. There could be a blockade, China stopping things from coming into Taiwan. Of course, some ships might slip through, but this would stop a lot of the traffic going in and out of the country. And so this is a common response, a common sort of non-military naval response that countries with the power to do it have as an option. So they would stop any Soviet ships coming in, they would inspect them, or they would force them to turn around and go away. The idea being that if they have a few missiles in Cuba, that's bad, but if they have many missiles in Cuba, that would be much worse.
And the Soviets, or the Russians, the people from the USSR there, were furious. Okay, that just means you're very, very angry. You're mad, you're angry, and then you're furious. They were extremely upset at this situation, and they sent several ships to approach the blockade. So it looked like there was going to be a naval battle there with Soviet ships coming into the Caribbean Sea, and they were about ready to attack the Americans who were blockading Cuba. And though they turned back at the last moment, tensions remained high. So they decided not to engage the American ships. They turned back at the last moment. So almost to the moment where they started shooting at each other, the Russians said, let's retreat, let's turn back, let's not escalate this situation, and maybe we can figure out a way to resolve this situation peacefully.
With no peaceful solution in sight, the U.S. began to prepare for a possible attack on Cuba. So this is when tensions were probably at their highest. This blockade had been imposed. It was stopping Soviet ships from entering into the Cuban area, and there was no peaceful solution in sight. They weren't having high-level talks between the presidents or anything like that, between the leaders of the countries, and it seemed no peaceful solution, no way out of this, short of fighting and war, was possible. When something is in sight, well, physically you can see something. You might be driving on the highway and notice you're running out of gas and kind of look forward and say, no gas stations in sight. I can't see any. We can also use it in another way, like we're using it here in this sentence, to talk about nothing seemed possible. There didn't seem to be any good prospects or any good opportunities or something like that. So it didn't seem likely that a peaceful solution could be found because no one was really working to achieve that. So the U.S. began to prepare for a possible attack on Cuba. And of course, a possible attack on Cuba, which was a close Soviet ally, could mean also the beginning of a very serious global war, World War III. And so, yes, tensions were very, very high at that time. All right, let's pause here, and then we'll read the third and final paragraph of our article. Then, out of the blue, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent a message. He offered to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. The next day, he sent a second message, asking the U.S. to also remove its missiles from Turkey. What would Kennedy do? Agreeing publicly to both of Khrushchev's conditions could make the U.S. look weak in front of its allies, but refusing might lead to nuclear war.
最后第三部分看到动词 invade， 它表示武装入侵或是侵略。 可以说 The Army's plans to invade quickly fell apart due to poor weather and disease. 因为恶劣天气和疾病，该军队入侵的计划很快就瓦解了。也可以说 Mongolian tribes invaded Europe in the 12th century. 12世纪时，蒙古部族入侵欧洲。
Okay, here's the third part of our article for today. It says, Then, out of the blue, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sent a message. So if something happens out of the blue, it is totally unexpected. Just like sometimes a meteor can fall from the sky, it's something coming out of the blue because the sky is blue. And sometimes things appear unexpectedly in the sky. So out of the blue, the Soviet leader Khrushchev sent a message. They were not expecting him to send this particular message. He offered to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. Okay, so this was his offer. I guess that's kind of surprising. You might imagine that, hey, we're not going to remove those missiles until you remove the missiles from Turkey. But this was kind of a different offer here. Hey, we'll get rid of those missiles in Cuba if you promise not to invade Cuba. So to invade just means an army from one country totally takes over another country or an area.
The next day, he sent a second message asking the U.S. to also remove its missiles from Turkey. So this seemed to be sort of an offer, a serious offer, but it was a little confusing to the Americans. They got these two messages, and of course, none of these came officially. It wasn't Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, making a speech on television. This all came through kind of back channels, people who know people in the diplomatic world. So it was a little confusing, but they got this second message saying, hey, if you remove your missiles from Turkey, we'll remove our missiles from Cuba, which is sort of reversing the actions that led to this crisis in the first place. So here's the question, what would Kennedy do? That's the big question. And of course, the world was waiting, and even President Kennedy's top ally or top advisors were waiting. I remember there was a big disagreement in the White House. Several of the military leaders were really strong on invading Cuba and attacking the missile sites, and other people were saying, no, that would be extremely dangerous. So all the tough decisions were resting on Kennedy's shoulders. It said agreeing publicly to both of Khrushchev's conditions could make the U.S. look weak in front of its allies, right? If your enemy is telling you or seemingly forcing you to back down, that might set a bad precedent and make you look weak, make you look like you can kind of be pushed around. And at the time, with America being the leader of the free world, the Western world, and NATO, the allies of America, countries like Britain, France, and Germany, and others, they might want America to look strong and not to sort of be intimidated by these Soviet threats. So your allies are your friends, the people who will work with you. It could just be, people you know in your life who are there to support you and back you up and help you when you need help, but also in the diplomatic world, in the world of global politics, these are the countries that might go to war on your side. When we talk about World War II, of course, we talk about the U.S., Britain, Russia, many Commonwealth countries of Britain were also all fighting on the same side. They were the allies. They were fighting together, even though they were independent, different nations.
But refusing might lead to nuclear war. And we're just going to leave it there because we really don't know what happened. Well, we actually know, but that's for us to know and you to find out. You need to do your own research to find out, hey, did the Americans acquiesce to the Russians? Did they agree to their conditions? Or did they get to keep those nuclear weapons in Turkey and figure out some other way to get the missiles out of Cuba? We're not going to tell you that. Again, this is for you to find out yourself. Okay, that brings us to the end of our explanation for today. Here comes Hanny, our beloved Chinese teacher.
各位同学大家好，我是 Hanny。 我们来看今天的文法重点。这一篇课文的标题是 The month the whole world held its breath， 全世界屏息以待的一个月。好，那么 hold one's breath 是把呼吸 hold 住，就是表达屏住呼吸憋气。不过呢，它在课文里面是表达某人屏住气息，屏气凝神，常常用来描述紧张或者是期待的情况。还有一个口语的用法叫做 don't hold your breath， 用来表达 不要期待某件事会很快发生。这有点就像是在说，不用屏息以待，不要抱太大的希望，这件事很可能不会发生。假设朋友说他那个小气巴拉的老板可能会帮他加薪，这时候就可以开玩笑对朋友说Don't hold your breath， 意思就是你不要期待过高，别高兴得太早，有可能根本不会有加薪这件事发生。好，顺便补充几个跟 breath 相关的用语。第一个是 take one's breath away， 把某人的呼吸带走，引申的意思就是令人屏息，令人惊叹。这个片语常常用来描述美景，让人赞叹不已，叹为观止。第二个补充的是 a breath of fresh air， 这个用语可以照字面意思来使用。Let's go outside and get a breath of fresh air， 意思就是我们去外面呼吸一点新鲜空气吧。那这个用语还可以表达令人耳目一新的事物。举例来说 Their music is like a breath of fresh air， 他们的音乐令人感到耳目一新。好，那第三个介绍的用语叫做 waste one's breath， 浪费呼吸，那其实是用来表达白费唇舌。我们可以用 save your breath 或者是 don't waste your breath 来表达省省力气吧，不用白费唇舌，怎么讲都没有用的。好，那么另外课文有出现好几次这个 missile 这个单字表示飞弹导弹，那我们来介绍一下它的字根。MISS 或者是 MIT 这类字根有送出投射的意思，像 missile 导弹飞弹其实就不难看出这个字根的语义。好，那这边也补充几个有这一类字根的单字。好，第一个介绍 emit， 它的字首 E 表示向外，由内向外，那么 MIT 表示送出投射，合在一起 emit 它就有发出发射或者是散发的意思。第二个补充 transmit， 它的字首 TRANS 表示 across， 它有跨越横越的意思，那么字根 MIT 表示 send 送出，合在一起 transmit 它就有传送传达的意思。第三个 dismiss，它的字首 DIS 表示离开远离，字根 MISS 它同样有 sent 或者是 let go 的意思，那把人送走叫人离开应该可以联想到 dismiss 它有解雇解散的意思咯。好，那以上今天重点整理，我们回顾今天单字吧。
Nuclear. Many countries have made considerable efforts to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Missile.During the battle, a large number of missiles were fired at the enemy forces. Furious. Sophie became furious when she learned that Omar had lied to her. Invade. As the winter snows began to melt, the army planned to invade the region from the north. Ally. The nation received significant support from its allies when dealing with the earthquake.
Discussion Starter starts now!
It's time now for our discussion starter, and the question is, do you think Kennedy's handling of the crisis was effective? Why or why not?
Well, I'll give the simple answer. Yes, I believe his actions were effective because the history books aren't filled with the story of World War III and how it started with the Cuban Missile Crisis. So by effectively diffusing this potential flashpoint, this potential cause of war, I think his actions were very effective.
Well, no, I don't think Kennedy handled the crisis well, given the fact that the Russians continue to have nuclear weapons pointed at the United States. And they still do up to now. And also, Kennedy must have been a really bad guy because Trump recently said that he's going to rename the Kennedy Center after his wife, so he must not really like him. Well, that brings us to the end of another edition of our program, and please make sure you join us again next time. From all of us here, I am Roger.
I am Mike.
See you next time.